Yeah, okay, so the wife. You remember that when Jonathan Pryce came on the show recently, what did he come on to talk about?
Recently, that'll be about 10 years ago.
10 years ago. Was he on to talk about the Terry Gilliam film? No. He was on to talk about Charles Dickens, wasn't he? There was a Charles Dickens film that wasn't very memorable.
Obviously not
memorable,
very memorable.
okay. But so fine, and he talked briefly about the fact that he'd made this film with Glenn Close called The Wife. Okay, so this is an adaptation of Meg Wollitzer's novel. The script is written by Jane Anderson, and it's directed by Björn Runge, and set in the early 90s. And at the beginning of it, we meet this writer, Joseph Castleman, played by Jonathan Pryce, and he is awaiting a phone call, and he can't sleep, and he's got up in the middle of the night, and he's eating, and Glenn Close is his wife, and she's in bed. She says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I can't sleep." She says, "Stop eating sugar. That's going to keep you awake." So it's apparent very, very early on that she's sort of the person who keeps him in check, and he's waiting for a phone call to come in, and then first thing in the morning, the phone call comes in, and he hears it, and the person at the other end says, "This is I'm calling you from the Nobel." So that's what he's been waiting for. He's been waiting for a phone call about whether or not he is actually going to win the big prize for literature. And the first thing he does, and this is really important, is he says, "Okay, can you hold on a minute? I want my wife to be on the extension while you tell me this." He says, "That's absolutely fine, Mr. Castleman, we can wait for that." So Glenn Close then runs out the bedroom, goes into the next room, picks up the phone, and she then listens as the announcement comes in. And so the scene cuts between him receiving the call and her listening to the call. Here's a clip.
Listen, before you go on, I'd like my wife to get on the extension. Would that be all right?
Yes, of course. I'll wait.
Hello, I'm on.
Hello, Mrs. Castleman. Is that you?
Yes.
Mr. Castleman, you're still on as well?
Yes, I am.
It is my great honor and pleasure to tell you, Mr. Castleman, that you have been chosen to receive this year's Nobel Prize in Literature.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Castleman, we are so delighted to be giving you this prize. Your career has a truly remarkable span to it. Not only do you write with extraordinary intimacy, wit and depth, you have also challenged the novelistic form in ways that will affect generations of writers to come.
Well, I should be getting something for all the grey in my beard.
Indeed, yes. And thank you for doing so on the world's behalf. Mrs. Castleman,
Yes.
you should know that your husband will be fending off the press today, so what I advise is that you monitor his calls, as it does get quite exhausting.
Yes. I'll take good care of him.
I remember this thing that Robert Redford once said about that what should happen at the beginning of a movie, and specifically he was talking about the opening shot of a movie, but the beginning of a movie. He said at the beginning of a movie should set up everything that's going to happen in the movie, and the rest of the movie is then really about those things unraveling or expanding or flowering or whatever. And you do get a very good example of this at the beginning of The Wife. You heard that call, and he very quickly says, he makes a joke about, yes, well, I should get something for all this grey in my beard. What you can't hear from that clip is that the camera is looking at the character of Joan, played by Glenn Close. And there is this look on Glenn Close's face. And it's, Glenn Close has got one of those faces. I mean, she can telegraph emotions like almost no other screen actor. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. She has like kaleidoscopic eyes. And you read so much in this expression. You're looking at this expression, and in it you see pride, and maybe you see regret, and then there's something else in the back of it, which, is it horror? Is it awe? And all this stuff is going on in this close-up of her face. Then the next thing is he starts jumping out up and down on the bed singing, "I won the Nobel, I won the Nobel," like, literally like a child. And he gets her to jump up and down on the bed with him, which is a scene to which we'll return later on. But then very quickly she says, "Okay, I've got to get ready. I've got to sort things out." And the next thing is that she is basically the person who's facilitating everything that has to happen. As she was told in that phone call, your husband's going to be very busy, so please take care of him. So this is clearly the role that she plays, is that she's looking after him. She's the keeper of his flame. They have a little event back at home in which we start to see family rivalries playing out. And the next thing is they've got to go off to Stockholm, and she will accompany him, as the whole family will come along. And she looks after him. She makes sure he takes his medication. She makes sure he's eating. She makes sure he hasn't got crumbs in his beard when he's appearing in public. She makes sure that he doesn't look ridiculous, even when very early on he actually forgets the name of one of the characters in his novel. So I don't know, is he starting to lose the plot? They are pursued on this journey by an investigative reporter who wants to be a biographer, played by Christian Slater, who's called Nathaniel Byrne, who's desperately trying to write the biography of Joe Castleman. And he thinks that all is not well, and he's starting to pick away at the facade. He's starting to individually pick off individual family members and talking to them, because he thinks that there's something wrong when he says to Joan at one point, he says, "I think you're sick of this. I think you're sick of what's going on." And there is a sense that yes, there is some deep-seated resentment, possibly. Maybe it's the fact that Joe is so high-handed about his son, who's an aspiring writer, and who he cannot find it within himself to praise. He says, oh yes, he's developing a voice. Maybe it's the fact that he is famously having affairs. He's been having affairs all the time. And at one point, the biographer says, I know about his indiscretions. And she says, yes, I'm sure you do. Maybe it's that. She sort of seems to tolerate that. Or maybe there's something else. Now, meanwhile, the main narrative is interspersed with flashbacks to their early relationship in the 1950s, 1960s, when he was a professor and she was an aspiring writer. She was somebody who's trying to learn how to write. And she obviously has an enormous amount of promise. She writes a book called a story called The Faculty Wife, sorry, am I boring you?
No, I've just been up since 4:30. I'm concentrating intently on everything you're saying.
So she's written this story called The Faculty Wife, which apparently is very, very good. But she then starts having an affair with him. He's married at that point, and their relationship begins. So all the time you're in the 90s, you're aware that she once was somebody who showed great promise as a writer, but had discovered at a very early age that women writers at that point are not taken seriously. In fact, at one point she's told by another woman writer who's published but ignored, don't ever kid yourself that you can get their attention. And she says, who? She says, the men, the publishers, the critics, the ones who decide who gets to be taken seriously. So essentially you have this tension, because you've got this celebrated author who's played rather brilliantly by Jonathan Pryce as somebody who's narcissistic and full of himself, and he's libidinous, he's constantly having affairs, he's difficult with his kids, but he has apparently written this stuff which the world should be grateful for. On the other hand, you have Glenn Close as the power behind the throne, the sort of so-called wife who looks after him and makes sure he's in the right place, make sure he's because clearly the person who's keeping all his life together, and clearly the person who had put her own talent on hold in order to service him. And there's something more going on in the background. Now, what I liked about this film, I saw this twice in 2 days. The first time I saw it, I liked it. Second time I saw it, I liked it very much. And there is a weird thing that sometimes really, really great performances only reveal themselves fully when you see them a second time, when you know how a story's going. As I said, that thing about Robert Redford says everything should be set up at the beginning of the film. So in a way, at the beginning of The Wife, you kind of understand everything you need to understand in that opening, when he gets the phone call and the camera focuses on her face, and we just look at Glenn Close's face and think, what's she thinking? Because there's so many things going on in that expression. And then when you know what it is that she's thinking, when to some extent the puzzle has been solved, but you sort of always knew what it was, you go back and watch it again, you think, I'm sorry, that is just astonishing. If the art of acting, I constantly go on about this thing, show, don't tell. Don't explain it with words, show it. Tell me through physical gesture and through facial expression and there are very few people who can do that as well as Glenn Close. And again, she is very ably supported by a very fine supporting cast. So Jonathan Pryce is terrific in the flashback scenes when we see the younger Joan and Joni. That's Harry Lloyd and Annie Stark. Annie Stark playing the younger Joan, of course, is Glenn Close's daughter, but is a very, very accomplished actor in her own right. This score, which is kind of full of cellos and yearning strings, which sort of suggests almost like a kind of sort of noirish mystery. I mean, almost sometimes like a kind of mystery thriller going on in the background. But a film which is really centrally dependent on Glenn Close's ability to give you the impression that she is holding two conflicting thoughts in her mind. That famous thing, if the definition of intelligence is the ability to hold two conflicting thoughts in the same brain at the same time, then she is the smartest actor on screen at the moment.